To be honest, having looked at the declining player counts for Rome Remastered, I was beginning to fear that maybe the Creative Assembly and Feral Interactive were beginning to see Rome Remastered as a bit of a lost cause. But this new patch looks really promising, and it directly addresses quite a few of the points that I raised as negatives in my review, including some of the ones that I didn't see anyone else mention. To me, this gives the sense that the devs are actively listening to the community, which is great, and we have seen a few patches come and go, which have been really focused on bug fixes and have not been overly encouraging, to be honest. But this one feels a bit different, and I'd say it's focused on three main things. The first is modding, the second is the user interface, and the third is, I would say, pathfinding. So those are three big areas where there have been question marks around Remastered, and it does look to me like they are actually addressing these. So I'm going to go through the patch notes, and I'm just going to pick out a few things that look like highlights to me. So firstly, on modding, there is a new combined mode, which is designed to take all of the various different features that you could get in the three different versions of the game. So that's the original Rome Total War, Barbarian Invasion, and Alexander. All of these can now be combined in the same mods, which is great because in the past, there were sometimes issues around mods which would rely on, for example, religion. If you had religion in a mod, for example, you couldn't base the mod on the original Rome, you would have to base it on Barbarian Invasion instead. So this change means that any new mods coming out can actually take all of these different features. They don't have to base it on one particular version of the game, they can just combine them all into one comprehensive mod. Hard to say exactly what this is going to look like, and just like with everything modding, how far this goes kind of depends on the community and how far they decide to take it, but it does look really promising and it should make life a lot easier for modders. Another thing is they've raised the limits of various things that could previously hold mods back. They haven't yet raised the faction cap, but I understand they are going to do that in a future release, and certainly this does look like a big step in the right direction. So the three things they've increased are the number of different types of units you can have in a mod, the number of map regions you can have on the map, and the number of resources, which is maybe not quite as glamorous as the other two, but can actually be quite useful because it can be tied to, for example, which units are recruitable in certain locations. If we assume that a mod has 30 factions, for example, a cap of 500 units would be less than 20 unique units for each of those factions. So this definitely opens up a lot of possibilities in terms of diverse unit rosters. They've also added a few more minor changes which could be quite useful in modding. So for example, they've added a new building bonus that can increase the number of construction and recruitment points that a settlement can have. That's going to open up a lot of potential for changes to certain settlements. So for example, you could have settlements that recruit faster than other settlements. You could have factions that have access to buildings which enable them to recruit units more quickly or to build buildings more quickly. And that could be balanced against, for example, having a slightly weaker unit roster. So that does potentially change quite a lot in terms of how certain factions will feel when played as part of mods. There's also the option to disable stamina for certain types of units, or to disable the amount of ammo that units have. So that's going to be really useful for certain types of units, particularly I think in fantasy mods. So you could have certain types of units that just never get tired. You could have units that, for example, throw projectiles that they produce themselves. So in that type of scenario, it wouldn't really make sense that the units would be limited in terms of how much ammo they have. There's also been a lot of changes made to scripting, and I'm not even going to pretend to really understand this stuff, but I do know enough to know that this also has a lot of potential in terms of what it could change. So the ability to add more hidden resources to the game, for example, could be really useful in terms of giving more regions exclusive units. Hidden resources are already used in the base game, like for example the first cohorts, the Legionary First Cohort and Early Legionary First Cohorts, are only available in Rome because Rome has a hidden resource that essentially allows that type of unit to be recruited. Obviously with mods that could be expanded a lot further, and there could be a lot more region-based recruitment. As for support for persistent variables that are stored inside the player's save game, I don't know exactly what that's likely to apply to, but I suspect this is going to be potentially used as a way to add different types of currency to the game. So for example, you could have certain variables that are going to limit the player in terms of what they can build, but they're not going to be determined by how much gold the player has. So in a fantasy mod, that could be something like the amount of spell points that a player has, or magic or something. And in a more historical mod, could be something like the amount of food that a player has for their population, or the amount of certain types of resources they have, like for example, you could link it to wood, you could link it to iron ore. There are quite a few different possibilities, and I'm sure modders will be able to come up with some much more interesting examples than that. Next big area they've improved is the user interface, and For some people it's not going to be enough, there are just aspects of the UI that they'll see as unfixable, but certainly for me they've definitely made some changes here that are going to make the game feel a lot more snappy and a lot less clunky. Top of the list is that you can now rename settlements by double-clicking the settlement name. That's not really something that interested me too much, but I think it is pretty cool in terms of role-playing, and it's something that might interest people, particularly when they're playing mods. One of the really big ones for me is that you can now change tax rates within the settlement list or within the settlement overview panel. So this is essentially, if you click on a settlement, you will immediately be able to adjust the tax rate, and you can also do it from the actual list of settlements. And this is one of the major issues I had with the UI, because if you're a good player in particular, you're probably going to be tweaking tax rates constantly, and to have to go through extra clicks to open up different menus is a real drag, and this is going to make it a lot more snappy. You can now click on any settlement and you'll immediately have the option to change the tax rates without having to click on settlement details. You've also got the point to the north button, which is useful if you've rotated the campaign map. I personally haven't really tried to do that myself, and I guess part of the reason is that fear that I can't reset it, so that's definitely a nice change if you do like to spin things around a bit. Also, you can double click on settlements to automatically open their construction panel, which is pretty useful because that's one of those things that, again, you're going to be doing it pretty much every single turn, and to be able to do it just with a double click instead of opening up several different menus, it's definitely going to speed things along. Projected turn income has also been added to the minimap panel, which is, again, a really useful thing because that's one of the most important things you need to know in order to plan out your next turn. And selecting a general from the army list now automatically selects their entire army, which is, again, one of those things that's going to make the army list feel a lot more practical and a lot more snappy, and enable you to more easily use it to actually move different armies around. There's also a button for auto-sorting units, which is great because previously and in the original Rome, you would usually just have to take certain units out of your army altogether and then have them rejoin in a certain order. Didn't really make sense, and of course auto-sorting is going to help you keep things a lot more organized. And another change is that any alerts that require player input are going to automatically open at the start of the turn. Can't think of many examples off the top of my head, but I think this will prevent situations like, for example, in my Greek campaign, I was offered a family member to adopt, and when I tried to accept them, it turned out they'd already died. I'm pretty sure that was linked to what had already happened in that turn. Not 100% sure, but I think that's what the problem was. So in this case, you should now be offered something like that right at the start of the turn. So you can deal with things like that immediately without having to click through the notifications panels, which are, again, I think seen as a little bit clunky by the majority of players. One of my absolute favourite changes is you can now open up the settlement list and you can scroll through your various settlements using the two arrows without it automatically flipping over to your generals and scrolling through those instead. That's really useful if you're doing something like trying to scroll through each of your towns in turn in order to sort out their taxes or their construction queues or their recruitment queues. Another change I really like is they've added an ammo per soldier count to each missile unit's descriptions, which is really useful if you're trying to find out, for example, how long each of your units can fire before they typically run out of ammo. There are lots of other changes too, which I'm not going to go through in this video, but I will leave a link to the patch notes in the description. There are lots of changes as well to the campaign AI, like, for example, it should be better now at actually judging how strong a navy is. They've also added the ability for the AI to trigger night battles as well, which makes perfect sense because, of course, it is something the player can do themselves. There are changes to diplomacy, like the AI should be more reasonable about military access requests. They should be more clear in response to ceasefire proposals, and there are also various changes to compensation. I've not really used compensation, but I understand that when it was first released, it was really bugged and broken, so hopefully that should be working more or less as intended now. Also, faction reputations can now be improved by things like the length of time that you've stuck to your agreements, the duration of your alliances, and becoming an ally of another faction's ally. When it comes to behavior in battle, there's been quite a few changes. One of my favorites is just increasing the rate at which soldiers enter towers, because especially when you're playing on the larger unit scales, the amount of time you have to wait for units to actually make their way up is really annoying and really takes away a lot from the flow of the game. That's a really small change, but it will make siege battles feel a lot more smooth. And you will notice that a lot of the patch notes for battle are specifically linked to pathfinding. So for example, unit paths will snap to the center of a footpath where space is limited. Hard to say exactly what that does, hard to really test it as well, but it's certainly a step in the right direction. Units will form up along streets if there's no space to move into a column formation. Again, don't know exactly what that's going to look like, but that is one of the key areas where pathfinding does tend to break down, so anything they can do to improve that is going to go a long way. It also says that they've improved AI path processing by allowing for subdividing. Again, don't know what that means, but it certainly sounds promising. Fixed an issue where pathfinding movement indicators could be stuck along waypoints after moving past them. I think I've experienced that a couple of times myself, so that's good. And also improved pathfinding when sending units to the center of a settlement, and that is definitely an area where I really noticed the pathfinding being bad, because you'll have an open square and your units will just refuse to charge into it. I don't know if they've completely resolved this. I've not really tested it much, but certainly that is a real problem that people have noticed, both with the original Rome and with the remastered. So if they have fixed that, again, that's really a big step in the right direction. They've also improved the AI to better avoid the attack range of defensive wall towers. Again, anything they can do to make the AI a bit less stupid is great, because at the moment, or at least in the previous patch, they would just leave units in front of watchtowers, and they would just get whittled down over time for no apparent reason. They might still do that from time to time, but again, anything they can do to make the game more challenging, I think is definitely going to be welcome. In multiplayer, the AI now assumes control of armies when players are kicked or disconnected mid-battle. Again, that sounds like a really good change, just to hopefully tide things along and stop it from being an instant loss when one of your allies disconnects. But all in all, this is probably not going to be enough to really get the multiplayer scene going, and I'm hoping they will focus on that a bit more in future patches. Outside of that, there are lots of other bug fixes and things. A lot of these bugs I've not really experienced, so I'm not really going to talk about them, but it all looks really promising, and of course, it has to be remembered that this is not going to be the final patch. I'm pretty sure they're going to keep making changes like this in future, so if nothing else, this is really encouraging in terms of the game's potential longevity, and I hope people do give it another chance and go back to it and try it, because this could be really incredible, particularly when it comes to mods. I think the base game is maybe always going to feel a bit too dated, but the modding potential here is incredible, and when you think of the number of really spectacular mods for Medieval 2 and the original Rome, there are a lot more possibilities here. Possibly the barriers to entry are a bit higher, but there are a lot more possibilities here, so hopefully people will take an interest and the game will keep gaining players. Some of the UI issues have been fixed. Again, some players are just never going to be happy with the UI. It's pretty obvious they're not going to completely overhaul it, but definitely they made some steps in the right direction, and I'm sure they will continue to improve things in future patches. Anyway, those are some of the basics of the new patch, and those are all my thoughts, so I hope it's been helpful. I have had to stop my Greek campaign that I was working on for a couple of months because my last PC broke mid-campaign. I am now planning to resume that, by the way, so if you're watching that series, that is going to be coming back. If you'd like to watch it, do subscribe so you can catch future episodes as they come out, or you can of course go back to episode 1. But that's going to be all for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.